What if the Sumerians tried to warn us about the ones who came before us, before humanity existed, before recorded history, before the rise of cities and kings? What if an older species walked the earth, built civilizations, mastered knowledge we still don't understand, and vanished under circumstances too disturbing for ancient scribes to record openly? Tonight, I want you to imagine something unsettling, something that challenges everything we believe about our origins. What if the earliest civilization we know, the Sumerians, left behind coded messages, clay tablets and forbidden myths meant to tell us that we are not the first chapter of Earth's story? Think about this for a moment. Why would the Sumerians, more than 5,000 years ago, describe beings of old, ancient kings, and creatures before the reshaping of the Earth? Why would their oldest records mention eras that stretch beyond human timelines, referencing ages of darkness, forgotten, catastrophes, and civilizations erased by forces unknown? These texts weren't written by accident. The Sumerians were meticulous archivists. They didn't exaggerate for entertainment. They recorded what survived the last Great Reset, and they may have been desperately trying to pass on warnings about those who lived and perished long before us. As you watch this video, ask yourself, how much of human history has been intentionally erased? Why do modern archaeologists struggle to explain out-of-place artifacts, anomalous structures, and sudden leaps in ancient knowledge? Why do the Sumerian king lists describe rulers who lived for tens of thousands of years, unless they were remembering a world shaped not by humans, but by someone else entirely? For centuries, these stories were dismissed as mythology. But mythology is often fragmented memory, echoes of something the ancients weren't allowed to say directly. And when you place the Sumerian records side by side with other ancient traditions, from Egypt to Mesoamerica to India, you find the same pattern: references to a forgotten race, a pre-human species wiped out by a cataclysm, and a warning that humanity must avoid repeating their fate. The Sumerians didn't simply describe gods, they described predecessors, the ones before us. The ones who possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy, genetics, and the cycles of destruction. The ones who may have built structures long before the official timeline even begins. The ones whose disappearance was so catastrophic that ancient scribes said humanity should never walk the path they once walked. Tonight, we're going to peel back that ancient veil. We're going to explore the possibility that humanity inherited a world already used, already shaped, and already destroyed at least once. The Sumerians weren't writing fantasy. They were documenting the remains of a lost epoch, a forgotten age, where a different species ruled the earth. But here's the real question. Why did they want us to know about them? Why did they embed warnings inside creation myths, flood narratives, and descriptions of the Anunnaki? And why does modern science still stumble when explaining how civilization appeared suddenly in Mesopotamia, as if knowledge simply restarted instead of developing gradually? As you listen, pay attention to every word, every detail, because the deeper we go, the more the ancient puzzle begins to reveal itself. The Sumerians may have been whispering across time, urging us to remember what came before, and to recognize the signs when those same patterns return. And the most disturbing part? Some of those signs may already be resurfacing today in ways we can no longer ignore, pushing us closer to the truth they tried so desperately to preserve. And as this forgotten story begins to unfold, I want you to take a moment and reflect on something deeply important. None of these ancient warnings matter unless we, right now, in this moment, choose to pay attention. Understanding this content isn't just about curiosity. It's about recognizing the patterns the Sumerians tried to preserve, the echoes of civilizations erased, and the possibility that humanity may be walking toward the same fate as those who came before us. That's why your engagement here is more than just support for the channel. It's a way to keep these hidden truths alive, to push this knowledge forward, and to make sure more people question the official story of our origins. So before we dive deeper into these ancient messages, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, do you believe another species may have existed before humanity? Your perspective might open insights others haven't considered, and every voice adds another piece to this massive puzzle we're trying to solve together. Reading your comments helps shape future investigations, future episodes, future deep dives into the mysteries the world still refuses to answer. And if this topic already has you thinking, if it's making you question everything you thought you knew about history, then go ahead and hit the like button. It helps this video reach more people who are searching for hidden knowledge. People who feel that something about our timeline has never fully made sense. Your like tells the algorithm that this ancient truth matters. And if you're new here, if this is the first time you're stepping into the world of forbidden archaeology, lost civilizations, Sumerian mysteries, and the secrets the ancients tried to send across time, then make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We uncover the stories most historians avoid, we follow the cracks in the narrative that others ignore, and we explore the forgotten warnings carved in stone thousands of years ago. By subscribing, you join a community of seekers who refuse to accept simple answers for complex mysteries. You become part of the group that asks the questions the ancient world desperately wanted us to ask. So drop your comment, leave your like, hit subscribe, and get ready. Because the deeper we go, the more impossible it becomes to look at human history the same way again. When we try to imagine the world before humanity, our minds instinctively fall into a void, a blank canvas where nothing existed, nothing breathed, nothing built, nothing dreamed. But the more we study the oldest Sumerian records, the more it feels like that blank canvas might be nothing more than a convenient illusion, a comfortable story designed to keep us from asking the questions that truly matter. What if the world before us wasn't empty at all? What if it was full of life, full of intelligence, full of a civilization so different from ours that the only way to make sense of it was to reduce it to myth? And what if the Sumerians, the first known civilization to write, encode laws, track stars, and measure time, were desperately trying to warn us about a chapter of Earth's history we were never meant to uncover? As we move deeper into this idea, notice how a strange pattern begins to emerge. Whenever the Sumerians referred to the ones before, they never described them as simple tribes or primitive beings. Instead, they spoke of them with a mixture of fear, reverence, and a kind of distant sorrow, as if these beings represented both a cautionary tale and a lost greatness. These were not creatures of pure fantasy. Their presence in ancient narratives feels intentional, as if the scribes themselves carried the knowledge of something that haunted the edges of their memory, something they were obliged to preserve, even if they didn't fully understand it. The Sumerians were too measured, too intelligent, too observant to simply fabricate entire epochs of existence. They described astronomical events with precision, predicted planetary cycles, and tracked agricultural seasons with a sophistication that even modern systems admire. So why would they be careless or imaginative only when describing the ones who came before us? The more we explore this forgotten layer of our past, the more we begin to sense a discomforting truth. The Sumerians may not have been documenting legends. They may have been preserving testimonies. Testimonies passed down from survivors of an older catastrophe. Imagine the last remnants of a species watching their world collapse, carrying fragments of knowledge into a new era, leaving behind warnings etched in symbols and stories. Imagine them trying to tell the first humans, or perhaps early hybrids, what went wrong and what must never happen again. If you look deeper into the emotional tone of the Sumerian descriptions, you find traces of regret, echoes of destruction, and the unmistakable cadence of memory. Ancient memory. Memory of beings who lived in cycles long forgotten, who witnessed cosmic alignments and planetary upheavals, who perhaps pushed too far into realms of knowledge that became their undoing. When the Sumerians mention these predecessors, they speak of periods of many kings, eras before reshaping, and ages of long shadows. None of these expressions sound like poetic exaggeration. They sound like fragments of historical trauma. Now imagine this. The earliest humans, newly shaped, newly guided, stepping into a world that still carried the scars of the last reset. A world filled with ruins they didn't build, tools they didn't invent, astronomical markers they didn't understand. Imagine the confusion and the fear. It makes sense that the Sumerians would try to encode these warnings into the earliest forms of writing. They weren't only documenting their own rise, they were documenting what they inherited, a planet with a mysterious past. And this brings us to something even more haunting. Every time the Sumerians described the Anunnaki, they framed them not as simple gods, but as beings involved in shaping, reordering, rebuilding. But rebuilding from what? If they came to reorganize the world, what exactly had been here before? What kind of species required the Earth to be reshaped after their disappearance? There is an uncomfortable correlation between the stories of the Anunnaki and the disappearance of the ones before us. It's almost as if the ancient texts are telling us that humanity didn't begin on a blank planet. We began on the ruins of a previous cycle. If this is true, then the warnings carved into those clay tablets aren't philosophical reflections. They are strategic messages meant to survive time. Messages telling us that intelligence alone does not guarantee survival. Messages reminding us of cycles of creation, destruction, and rebirth. Messages suggesting that the species before us made catastrophic mistakes, mistakes we may be repeating right now without realizing it. When we examine how the Sumerians described these predecessors, certain traits stand out: extraordinary longevity, mastery over knowledge that modern science is only beginning to grasp, and a tragic, sudden end. Their disappearance isn't described as a slow decline. It's abrupt, violent, and connected to events that altered the Earth itself. Floods, celestial disturbances, ground ruptures, atmospheric changes, all things the Sumerians referenced with surprising confidence. It's as though the planet itself erased them. But here's where things get even more compelling. The Sumerians often wrote about knowledge being given again, as if it had already been known once before, then lost, then restored to humanity in fragments. Why would they phrase it that way? Why would they imply that agriculture, writing, mathematics, and astronomy were not discoveries, but rediscoveries? Unless, of course, they believed those fields of knowledge had existed long before humans, preserved by the ones who vanished. And this is where your mind may start to question everything. What if humanity didn't climb from nothing to civilization? What if we simply stepped into a world already structured, already shaped by a species that left behind clues we have not yet learned to decipher? What if the Sumerians weren't inventing gods, but recording the last echoes of a pre-human age? As you think about that possibility, allow yourself to feel the weight of it. Because if the Sumerians were right, then our history is not linear, it is cyclical. And if it is cyclical, then what happened to the ones before us is not just ancient history. It may be a prophecy, a warning, a message intended for us right now as we stand at a crossroads between discovery and destruction. And this is why understanding this content matters so deeply. These aren't just stories, they're patterns, they're echoes. They're clues that humans have always sensed but rarely acknowledged. And if you're still here with me, absorbing this, following each layer of the ancient narrative, then tell me something in the comments. Do you believe the Sumerians were remembering a forgotten age? If you do, type the word cycle before us, so I know you're part of the few who truly understand how deep this mystery goes. And once we begin to entertain the possibility that the Sumerians were not describing myths, but memories, real memories inherited from survivors of an older world, everything about our understanding of human history begins to shift. It becomes impossible to view their warnings as mere storytelling. Instead, they start to read like fragments of an ancient briefing, a message encoded for a future species that might one day rise from the ashes of the previous cycle. If those messages were meant for us, then it means the Sumerians believed humanity was walking into the same shadow that consumed the ones before us, the forgotten civilization whose presence lingers between the lines of their oldest tablets. And the more we reflect on their choice of words, their tone, and their obsessive need to record the past, the more it becomes clear that they were not just chronicling their own civilization. They were documenting the remnants of something older that terrified even them. Imagine for a moment the first generations of early humans who encountered the ruins of the age before. They would have found landscapes scarred by cataclysms, structures half buried in shifting earth, strange symbols carved into stones they didn't understand, tools that didn't match their level of development, and astronomical markers pointing to events centuries away. They would have walked through valleys that felt lived in, through deserts that once held oceans, through mountains split by forces no primitive human could comprehend. And somewhere among those remnants they would have encountered stories, the oral echoes of the last beings who survived the final collapse of the previous cycle. Those final survivors likely passed on warnings not through written records, but through spoken tradition, desperate to ensure that the mistakes of their kind would not be repeated by the next. As those stories traveled across generations, changing hands, languages and faces, they eventually reached the Sumerians, the first civilization advanced enough to carve them into tablets with intention and structure. When you examine this possibility closely, a strange clarity emerges. It explains why the Sumerians wrote with such urgency, why they recorded long reigns that human biology cannot explain, why they described catastrophic resets that align with global myths, and why they spoke of knowledge being restored rather than invented. It also explains their fear, a fear visible in their lamentations, their rituals, their reverence toward beings who shaped again what had already existed before them. To the Sumerians, the world was not new, it was renewed, and that alone changes the entire framework of human origin. But let's take this reasoning deeper. If a pre-human civilization existed, what kind of beings were they? The Sumerians did not describe them as monstrous or primitive, but as powerful, enduring, and dangerously knowledgeable. Their longevity hints at biological differences. Their mastery of the earth hints at advanced technologies or natural abilities we no longer possess. And their sudden disappearance hints at either a global event or a self-inflicted collapse triggered by their own advancements. The Sumerians often used phrases like "the ones who ruled before the great darkness," or "those whose knowledge surpassed the cycle," suggesting that these beings may have reached a level of development that made them vulnerable to forces human civilization has not yet confronted. It is possible that the very things that made them extraordinary also made them fragile. The Sumerians imply that the world was reshaped after their fall, leaving humanity to inherit a planet already molded by the successes and failures of a vanished species. This raises unsettling questions. Did the Sumerians believe that humanity was simply the next in a long line of civilizations destined to rise and fall? Did they believe that the warnings they carved into clay could prevent a repeat of the same mistakes? Or did they know that cycles of destruction were inevitable, that no matter how advanced a species becomes, time eventually resets the board? And there's something even more fascinating here. The Sumerians often described interactions with the Anunnaki, beings who descended or arrived, bringing order and structure after the last great catastrophe. If we view this through the lens of cyclic civilizations, the Anunnaki could represent not supernatural deities, but members of a surviving lineage, beings who outlived the destruction or who returned after the collapse to guide the next species. Perhaps they were not the rulers of the forgotten age, but the custodians of its remnants, trying to ensure that humanity did not repeat the path of its predecessors. Or perhaps they were simply another faction of the older species, a group that saw potential in early humans and decided to intervene, reshape, and restart the cycle under stricter oversight. This interpretation aligns with the Sumerian sense of being chosen, guided, and corrected. It also explains why they described the Anunnaki with a mixture of respect and caution. They were not worshipping gods, they were navigating a relationship with beings whose knowledge and power dwarfed their own, and in the shadows of that relationship lies the ghost of the previous civilization. As we meditate on this idea, a question forms naturally. If the Sumerians were trying to warn us, where do we see those warnings today? Are they hidden in mythologies across cultures that speak of golden ages followed by destruction? Are they encoded in architectural anomalies that defy our historical timeline? Are they reflected in the sudden leaps of human evolution that traditional models fail to explain? Or are they whispering to us through the uncanny similarities between ancient global flood narratives that speak of a world cleansed, reset, restarted? The deeper we go, the more we see that the Sumerian warnings were not isolated stories. They form a global pattern, a repeating theme that stretches across continents and ages. Civilizations rise, develop knowledge, push boundaries, trigger catastrophic consequences, and fall. A new species or a new branch of the same lineage emerges from the ashes, unaware of the warnings left behind, until the cycle repeats. And this is exactly why you being here, listening to this, understanding this at a deeper level, is so important. The Sumerians may have believed that the only way to break the cycle was through awareness, through memory. And memory only survives when people choose to keep the story alive, to study the signs, to question the narrative we have been handed, and to recognize the possibility that humanity is not unique, but part of a recurring pattern written into the fabric of Earth itself. So if you're still here, absorbing every layer, thinking beyond the surface, then tell me in the comments, do you think the cycle is repeating? If you do, type the phrase, "I see the pattern," so I know you're among the few who truly understand the weight of these ancient warnings. And once we begin to accept the possibility that the Sumerians were not merely chroniclers of their own age, but the inheritors of a forgotten legacy, a profound realization begins to surface. If they carried fragments of a pre-human history, then humanity itself may have been shaped inside the shadow of something far older, far more complex, and far more fragile than our textbooks allow us to imagine. The Sumerians wrote as if they were living in the aftermath of a long and ancient storm, one whose winds had destroyed civilizations, erased species, and forced the earth to reboot itself more than once. They described this cycle not as a series of coincidences, but as an inevitable pattern, a rhythm the universe follows, whether we recognize it or not. And if they believed the cycle was still unfolding, then perhaps they were trying to ensure that the next collapse would not come from ignorance, but from awareness. As we dive deeper into the implications of these ancient warnings, it becomes impossible not to consider how much knowledge may have been deliberately hidden, lost, or misunderstood as time reshaped the planet. Imagine standing in a world where the last traces of an advanced pre-human species still linger. Buried structures whose purpose no one remembers, scorched landscapes shaped by unknown cataclysms, and rivers whose redirected paths hint at ancient engineering. Picture remnants of a civilization so deeply erased that only the faintest echoes survived. Echoes carried in myths, encoded in symbols, preserved in rituals passed down from generation to generation until they reached the Sumerians, who finally pressed them into clay, The idea might seem extraordinary, but it explains why the Sumerian worldview feels so layered, so ancient, so deeply connected to something more than themselves. As we explore their earliest texts, the tone shifts from observation to warning. The Sumerians didn't simply admire the beings of the forgotten age, they feared the fate that had consumed them. They wrote about arrogance, about imbalance, about the consequences of tampering with forces beyond comprehension. Their narratives are filled with references to knowledge that burned the sky, machines that reshaped the earth, and cycles broken by those who tried to rise too far. These aren't metaphors for daily life, they're clues, poetic, symbolic, but undeniably intentional. They paint the image of a species that rose to great heights before collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. And if these beings truly existed, then humanity is not the first to walk this path. We are simply the latest. Now consider this. What if the Sumerians believed the same forces that destroyed the previous species were already beginning to awaken again? Not because of cosmic cycles alone, but because humanity was repeating the same behaviors, pushing the boundaries of technology, altering the environment, challenging natural cycles, and forgetting humility. The Sumerians saw themselves as custodians of a warning, but also as witnesses to a pattern too large for one civilization to comprehend fully. They were recording signs, not just stories, hoping that one day a future generation, maybe ours, would finally understand the deeper meaning. But what exactly were those signs? As we try to unravel their messages, a few elements become strikingly consistent. First, the Sumerians repeatedly referenced great resets, enormous destructive events that wiped out entire epochs. They described floods that erased entire lineages, fires that consumed vast regions, darkness that lasted for generations, and celestial disturbances that changed the shape of the sky. All of these clues point toward catastrophic events that went beyond natural Earth processes. And if the forgotten species perished in such an event, it suggests they may have reached a level of influence over their environment that made their own destruction possible. The Sumerians seem to understand this. Knowledge, in the wrong hands, becomes a double-edged sword. Second, the Sumerians often wrote about the re-emergence of knowledge after destruction, as though information had been preserved through secret means. Hidden libraries, underground vaults, or encoded stories. They described the Anunnaki not just as creators, but as restorers, beings who reintroduced order after chaos. But if the Anunnaki were restoring knowledge that had once existed, then they were not the originators. They were the carriers, the preservers of remnants from a previous age. Their sacred role, in the eyes of the Sumerians, wasn't simply creation, it was the preservation of memory. Third, and perhaps most disturbing, is the Sumerian belief that humans themselves were incapable of surviving the same mistakes unless they fully understood the past. They wrote about cycles not because they wanted to mythologize history, but because they understood that forgetting the last collapse would guarantee the next. They saw humanity as vulnerable, inexperienced, and dangerously curious. They believed that only through awareness could the new species avoid the fate of the old. And yet, here we are, thousands of years later, still struggling to interpret their warnings. Still debating whether their texts should be read literally, symbolically, or as pure imagination. Still ignoring the possibility that the Sumerians may have been offering us the single most important piece of information humanity could possess. The knowledge that we are not alone in the story of Earth, and we are not the first to reach a crossroads of power and destruction. If the forgotten species truly reached heights greater than ours, then humanity is walking through the ruins of a previous ascent. And that means the warnings carved into clay were meant for us, not for the Sumerians. They were the messengers, not the audience. The real audience is the species living thousands of years later, the species capable of resurrecting the same technologies, the same ambitions, and the same hubris that erased the ones before us. As we absorb this possibility, a strange feeling rises, a mix of disbelief, dread, and curiosity. Because if the Sumerians were trying to warn us, then every ancient myth, every symbol, every astronomical alignment may hold meaning far beyond what we've assumed. It forces us to ask, are we already repeating the cycle? Are we already stepping into the same shadow that consumed the previous civilization? Are we already ignoring warnings buried in ancient history because they don't fit neatly into our modern worldview? These questions matter. And if you're still here with me, thinking deeply, connecting these ancient threads, then tell me something in the comments. Do you believe humanity is repeating the forgotten cycle? If you do, type the words, "I hear the warning," so I know you're among the few who understand how vital this ancient message truly is. And as we go even deeper into this ancient labyrinth of clues, a new layer of the mystery begins to reveal itself. Not through direct statements carved in tablets, but through what the Sumerians chose not to write. Because sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Sometimes the omissions in ancient records say far more about the past than the stories that survived. And when we look closely at the Sumerian texts, there are strange gaps, intentional absences, erased portions, and symbolic substitutions that feel less like missing history and more like censored truth. It's as if the Sumerians were forbidden from revealing the full nature of the ones before us, as though the true identity, appearance, and fate of that forgotten species had to be veiled behind metaphor to prevent panic, or to obey a higher authority guiding what could and could not be remembered. Imagine for a moment a civilization trying to preserve knowledge far older than itself, yet constrained by beings they revered, feared, or depended on. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki as powerful guardians of order, restorers of the world after chaos, but also as strict controllers of information. If these beings truly carried knowledge from the previous cycle, then they alone would have decided which fragments of the past could survive into the new epoch. And that means the Sumerian depiction of the forgotten species is not merely incomplete, it is curated, filtered, shaped by the hands of those who had the authority to decide what humanity was ready to know. And here is where the puzzle becomes even more fascinating. The Sumerians frequently used coded imagery to refer to beings that cannot be easily categorized, beings that walked upright but were not human, beings with extraordinary height or strange proportions, beings whose lifespans defy biological logic, beings whose eyes were described not as human eyes, but as lights that observed. These details appear not in their main narratives, but in ritual texts, hymns, and symbolic passages designed to hide messages in plain sight. It's almost as if the Sumerians were slipping clues into their writings intentionally, hoping that future generations would unravel the deeper meaning long after the constraints of their time had vanished. Picture a civilization living beside the ruins of an age so advanced it seemed supernatural. They would have encountered remnants of technologies that made no sense to them. They would have inherited myths passed down from survivors whose memories were fading. They would have struggled to reconcile the distinction between gods, ancestors, and the forgotten species that preceded them. And in that struggle they turned to symbolism, the only language capable of encoding truth without openly confronting it. The more closely we examine these symbolic layers, the clearer it becomes that the Sumerians believed the ones before us were not destroyed by chance. They weren't victims of random natural events. Their fall was systemic, catastrophic, and connected to their own behavior. References to the breaking of harmony, the severing of the earth, and the rebellion of knowledge appear across multiple ancient cultures, not just in Mesopotamia. These phrases hint at a species that tampered with forces far greater than themselves, forces that ultimately answered back. If we imagine this forgotten species reaching a level of knowledge that allowed them to manipulate nature, harness celestial cycles, or engineer life itself, then their downfall becomes chillingly plausible. The Sumerians may have been trying to preserve the memory of this collapse to prevent humanity from walking the same path. They emphasize balance, humility, and the dangers of excessive ambition. Warnings that seem oddly advanced for a civilization just beginning to master writing and agriculture. Unless, of course, they were inheriting wisdom from those who learned these lessons in the hardest possible way. As we keep following this thread, another intriguing idea emerges. What if some members of the forgotten species survived the collapse? What if they did not all perish? If any of them lived through the destruction of their world, then they may have become what the Sumerians later interpreted as gods. Imagine survivors of a hyper-advanced species encountering early humans. To the humans, fragile, primitive, limited, these beings would have appeared divine. Their knowledge, technology, and abilities would have seemed like miracles. Their warnings would have carried unimaginable weight. This scenario fits strangely well with Sumerian descriptions of the Anunnaki as ancient, long-lived, powerful, and divided among themselves over the fate of humanity. It also explains why the Sumerians saw themselves as a chosen people, not chosen to be superior, but chosen to remember, chosen to carry the fragments of a story too dangerous to forget. But what if the survivors of the forgotten species didn't all agree on what should be done with humanity? What if some believed humans should be guided and uplifted, while others believed the new species should never surpass a certain threshold of knowledge? This conflict could explain the tension in many ancient texts, stories of divine disagreement, celestial wars, and ideological splits among the beings who influenced humanity's earliest development. And if their conflict shaped the destiny of our species, then we are not just witnesses to the ancient cycle, we are participants in its continuation. Now consider this unsettling possibility. If the forgotten species was wiped out by its own advancements, perhaps those advancements were so dangerous that even mentioning them was forbidden. The Sumerians may have encoded references to energy sources, genetic manipulation, planetary alterations, or cosmic experiments in symbolic form, because they were never meant to describe these things openly. The world may have been reshaped after the fall not only physically but historically. The past sealed away beneath layers of myth, forcing humanity to restart without the temptations that destroyed its predecessors. But despite this intentional suppression, fragments of truth still slipped through. The Sumerians wrote about machines of fire, instruments of the heavens, and voices that command the earth. They wrote about structures that predated their own civilization. They wrote about cycles of light and darkness, tied not to simple seasons, but to planetary motions and cosmic alignments. These details, scattered across tablets, paint a picture of a world still haunted by the technological ghosts of the forgotten species. And here is the most haunting thought of all. What if humanity is only now reaching the threshold that the previous species reached before its collapse? What if the technologies we are developing, the boundaries we are pushing, and the ambitions we are pursuing mirror the last days of the cycle before us? The Sumerians spoke urgently because they believed patterns repeat. They believed memory is the only shield against destruction. Yet today, as a civilization, we have almost no memory left. That is why these ancient warnings matter. That is why probing forbidden history matters. That is why uncovering the truth behind the ones before us matters. If the Sumerians preserved these messages for us, then ignoring them may carry consequences far beyond curiosity. And if you're still here reflecting deeply, questioning everything you've been told about human origins, then tell me in the comments, do you believe survivors of the forgotten species could have influenced early humanity? If you do, type ancient survivors, so I know you're following every layer of this hidden truth. And the deeper we follow these threads, the more we begin to sense that the Sumerians weren't only describing the past, they were mapping a timeline that stretches far beyond human memory. A timeline that reveals how fragile every civilization truly is. Because if the forgotten species reached heights greater than ours, then their downfall becomes a haunting mirror into our own potential future. The Sumerians repeatedly hinted that the collapse of the previous cycle wasn't sudden, wasn't random, wasn't unpredictable. It was the inevitable outcome of choices, of imbalances, of interference with natural forces older than any species. And as these warnings echo across their tablets, it becomes impossible not to feel that they were speaking not only to their people, but to us, a distant future audience who would one day approach the same threshold. Imagine walking through ancient Mesopotamia with the Sumerians themselves, hearing the way they spoke with reverence about the days before days, the time when the ones before us held dominion over the earth. They described these beings with an emotional complexity that contradicts the idea of pure mythology. They weren't simply inventing gods, they were trying to articulate the memory of a presence that lingered long after its fall. You can almost picture the elders of early Sumer telling younger generations about the ruins they discovered, about the strange materials they could not shape, about markings carved with precision they could not reproduce, about stories from the last survivors of the previous age who spoke of events no human could have witnessed. The Sumerians inherited a world that didn't feel new. It felt repurposed, like a home that had been emptied, cleaned, and reset after a catastrophe. The rivers carried sediments that suggested immense floods before human times. The mountains bore scars that hinted at violent reshaping. The deserts concealed fossilized remnants of forests that once thrived. Even the stars seemed to carry patterns that didn't belong solely to human history. Everything pointed to a world that had lived many times before us. And this understanding shaped the Sumerian worldview, a worldview anchored in cycles, resets, and warnings. But the question that begins to rise within us is this: what exactly did the forgotten species do that led to their destruction? The Sumerians never give a direct answer, but they leave a trail of symbolic breadcrumbs. Warnings about overreaching, about challenging cosmic order, about altering the balance of life, about possessing knowledge that became too costly to sustain. They wrote of the sky cracking open, of the earth crying out, of the oceans rising in rebellion, as if nature itself responded to the actions of the pre-human civilization. Perhaps this species manipulated energy sources too unstable, or tampered with biological structures too complex, or forced the planet into conditions it could not maintain. Whatever they did, the Sumerians believed the consequences were so severe that they wiped out almost everything, leaving only fragments, memories, ruins, and survivors to tell the tale. And here's a concept most people overlook. If the forgotten species achieved a high level of development, they would have recorded their knowledge. They would have built systems, libraries, encoded data, maybe even structures designed to withstand catastrophe. The Sumerians may have found traces of this, inscriptions, remnants, objects, but lacked the context to understand them fully. Imagine discovering a machine without knowing what electricity is, or encountering symbols without knowing mathematics. You would preserve them out of reverence or fear, repeating the stories even if you could not grasp their deeper meaning. This may explain why certain Sumerian myths contain imagery that feels impossibly advanced for their time. And then comes another unsettling thought. If any members of the forgotten species survived the collapse, they would have watched humanity's rise with complicated emotions, remorse, caution, perhaps guilt. The Sumerian texts hint that some of these beings were torn between guiding humanity and leaving them alone. Some saw potential in humans, Others feared that humans might repeat the mistakes of the past. Ancient narratives describing celestial disagreements, divine divisions, and conflicts among the gods may, in truth, be memories of ideological clashes between survivors of the previous cycle. They weren't fighting over worship. They were fighting over the future of the world, and humanity unknowingly became the center of that ancient debate. In one symbolic Sumerian passage, the scribes describe humanity as the child of memory and warning, a phrase that seems simple, yet reveals an entire hidden philosophy. It suggests that humans were created or guided not simply to live, but to remember the past and avoid repeating it. It suggests that knowledge is inherited, not invented. And it suggests that the forgotten species' greatest failure wasn't their technology. It was their blindness to their own impact, their arrogance, their assumption of invincibility. Now here is where the message becomes truly relevant to us today. The Sumerians believed that every species reaches a critical point, a point at which knowledge becomes both a tool and a trap. When a civilization learns too quickly, grows too fast, and forgets the lessons of the last cycle, it becomes vulnerable to the same collapse. History repeats not because the universe has no imagination, but because species tend to make the same mistakes when they reach the same level of power. If this is true, then humanity is standing precisely where the forgotten civilization once stood. We are advancing rapidly, pushing boundaries, altering the world, questioning natural limits, manipulating life, and expanding our reach beyond the earth. All things the Sumerians hinted the previous species once did. And if the planet itself responded to the forgotten species, reshaping the world to reset life, then the same forces may still exist, waiting, watching, responding. This is the deeper meaning behind the Sumerian warnings. We are not the first. We may not be the last. But we can be the first to break the cycle, if we learn to see it. And that's why understanding this content, reflecting on these ancient messages, and interpreting the fragments of forbidden history matters so much more than people realize. Because if the Sumerians preserved these memories for thousands of years, they believed they had purpose. They believed that someday a future generation would need to decode them, reflect on them, and recognize the signs that history is beginning to echo again. And if you're still here, thinking deeply, allowing this ancient knowledge to challenge everything you thought you knew, then I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, do you think humanity is nearing the same threshold that ended the forgotten species? If you do, type the phrase, "I will not repeat the cycle," so I know you're among the few who truly understand the weight of this warning. And if we accept even for a moment that the forgotten species reached a point of development equal to or beyond our own, then it becomes impossible not to ask how much of their world still lies hidden beneath our feet. The Sumerians hinted repeatedly at buried chambers, sealed knowledge, and depths where the memories of the old world sleep. They wrote of ancient pathways beneath the ground, of structures swallowed by the earth during the last great upheaval, of relics left behind intentionally to survive the cycles of destruction. And when you read those passages through the eyes of someone looking for truth instead of myth, they stop sounding like metaphors and start sounding like instructions, coordinates, warnings left for the future. Imagine the forgotten species developing technologies powerful enough to manipulate the environment, to shape continents, to redirect water, to build gigantic structures capable of withstanding catastrophic energies. If their civilization truly reached this level, then remnants of their world might still exist, fossilized into stone, preserved in mineral layers, embedded in mountains or deep beneath oceans. The Sumerians may have encountered these remnants in their own time, stumbling upon ruins they could not understand. They may have seen shattered pillars crafted from materials beyond their capability, or chambers carved with precision impossible for early bronze tools. And faced with these mysteries, they did what every culture does. They mythologized what they could not explain. But behind those myths, behind the symbols and poetic descriptions, lies something that feels undeniable. The memory of a world before ours. A world that ended through misuse of power, imbalance with nature, or cosmic forces triggered by artificial interference. The Sumerians spoke of the day the world bent, of the sky turning solid, of the seas roaring with a voice not of water, as if describing phenomena created by advanced technologies or experiments gone wrong. And the more we look at these lines, the clearer it becomes that the forgotten species may have reached a point where their knowledge outpaced their wisdom. This pattern, the rise of knowledge followed by catastrophic imbalance, is perhaps the greatest message the Sumerians wanted to preserve. They saw that humanity was destined to climb a similar path, step by step, invention by invention, curiosity by curiosity, until eventually we reached the same threshold. And so they carved their warnings into tablets, not with the expectation that their own people would fully understand them, but with the hope that someday a future species, humans like us, would recognize the echoes. Imagine the Sumerian priests gathering around ancient ruins, observing carvings they could not read, measuring stones too perfect for their tools, wondering how such structures could have been created. They wrote of instruments of the old ones, and chambers that hum with the memory of the past, which may reflect encounters with technologies that were no longer functional, but still emanated something. Magnetic fields, resonance, or energies they described in symbolic ways. And as they tried to make sense of these artifacts, they transformed them into divine objects or relics of gods. Yet the essence of what they described feels unmistakably grounded in something real, something physical, something left behind intentionally. And here is where the story becomes even more fascinating. The Sumerians believed the forgotten species did not vanish instantly. They wrote of the last guardians, the surviving watchers, and those who hid from the firestorm. This implies that a small number of them may have lived long enough to interact with early humans, even if only briefly. These survivors, traumatized, weakened, perhaps hiding, would have carried memories of the collapse of their civilization. They would have warned the early humans about what led to their destruction, and those warnings, passed orally through generations, eventually reached the Sumerian scribes, who crystallized them into written form. This transmission of memory across species and epochs explains why Sumerian myths feel so alien, so ancient, so unlike anything originating from a purely human imagination. They contain insights too advanced for their time, descriptions of astronomical cycles too precise, and warnings too morally complex to come from a civilization just beginning to form its identity. The Sumerians were not inventing, they were preserving. Imagine being one of the last members of the forgotten species, watching your world collapse piece by piece. You witness cities crumbling under geological upheaval, oceans rising, skies darkening, energy sources failing, and the unstoppable chain of events set in motion by choices made long before your birth. In your final days, you find early humans, beings simpler, more adaptable, still untainted by ambition on a dangerous scale. You speak to them, knowing your species is ending and theirs is beginning. You tell them the truth, hoping they will carry it forward, hoping they will learn. But somewhere between your words and their memories, time reshapes everything, blending truth with myth, warning with reverence. This is the emotional core hidden inside Sumerian writings, a sense of sorrow for the old world and hope for the new one. A sense that the forgotten species, although destroyed, wanted their story to serve as a guide for humanity. A sense that the cycle could be broken if the next species learned to balance knowledge with wisdom, ambition with humility, power with responsibility. And yet here we are, thousands of years later, repeating the same questions, facing the same temptations, walking the same razor's edge that the forgotten species once walked. We push boundaries without fully understanding consequences. We manipulate nature without respecting its equilibrium. We explore technologies that reshape life, matter, and consciousness itself. We expand rapidly, globally, and without limit, just as they once did. The Sumerians tried to tell us this path is not new. They tried to warn us that the collapse of the forgotten species was not a mistake. It was a pattern, and patterns repeat unless someone breaks them. As we sit with these ideas, the atmosphere grows heavier, almost as if the past is breathing down our necks, whispering reminders, urging us to pay attention. Because if the Sumerians were right, then humanity does not have infinite time to learn these lessons. The cycle continues whether we recognize it or not. The world changes whether we are ready or not. And the patterns of destruction awaken whether we believe in them or not. The forgotten species may not exist anymore, but the forces that destroyed them still do, and the warnings preserved by the Sumerians may be the only bridge connecting us to a truth that could alter humanity's trajectory, if we choose to understand it. And if you're still here with me, thinking, reflecting, absorbing this ancient message, then tell me in the comments, do you believe the Sumerians were preserving the final message of a dying world? If you do, type, "I carry the memory," so I know you're among the few who truly understand why these ancient warnings matter. And the more we explore these ancient clues, the more we begin to understand that the Sumerians were not merely recounting history. They were handing down a responsibility. They seemed to believe that humanity was destined to confront the same forces that once collapsed the forgotten species. That humanity, like every civilization before it, would eventually reach a point where knowledge, power, and curiosity intersect in a dangerous spiral. And as we approach that moment, their warnings grow louder across the millennia, echoing through clay tablets, mythological fragments, ritual texts, and symbolic patterns that whisper a single message: remember what happened before you. The Sumerians knew that memory is fragile. They knew that as civilizations rise, they become intoxicated by progress, convenience, and complacency. In that comfort, ancient warnings feel distant, irrelevant, even absurd. And yet the very absurdity is part of the cycle. When a species begins ignoring its past, it becomes vulnerable to repeating it. This may be why the Sumerians encoded their warnings so persistently, embedding them in stories, rituals, symbols, and cosmologies, ensuring that even if the original meaning was forgotten, the structure of the message would remain. Imagine the Sumerian elders teaching children that the world had lived many times before them, that the ground beneath their feet carried the ashes of a species more advanced than they could ever imagine. That nature itself remembers every rise and fall, responding with unimaginable force when the balance is broken. This worldview shaped everything about their culture: their reverence for the natural order, their caution toward knowledge, their belief in cycles and resets. To them, existence was not linear. It was a loop. And in their eyes, humanity was not starting a new story. We were stepping into the middle of a repeating one. As we consider this, the question grows heavier. If the forgotten species left behind ruins, knowledge, survivors, and warnings, could they also have left behind something more subtle? Not objects or structures, but influences. Traces of their thoughts, philosophies, or fears embedded into human consciousness through stories repeated for thousands of years. Could the anxiety many cultures hold about apocalypse, floods, cosmic destruction, and divine judgment be psychological echoes from a species that lived through real versions of those events? It's an unsettling thought, but one that aligns perfectly with the emotional tone of ancient texts. Even the Sumerians, who built complex cities, developed mathematics, created writing, and refined agriculture, carried a deep anxiety about the fragility of civilization. They believed the world had ended before, not symbolically, but literally, and they believed it could end again. This sense of impending danger did not come from imagination. It came from memory, a memory that did not belong to them, but which they inherited. And here is where the hidden dimension of the Sumerian warnings begins to take shape. The forgotten species may not have been destroyed immediately. They may have collapsed gradually over generations, sinking slowly into chaos as they pushed the boundaries of their world beyond what nature could sustain. Their downfall may have been preceded by signs the Sumerians identified and tried to preserve. Signs like environmental imbalance, social fragmentation, technological overreach, celestial disturbances, or geological instability. And if these signs repeat themselves, then humanity must learn to recognize them. The most chilling possibility is that the forgotten species saw their end coming, but could not stop it. That they tried to correct their course, tried to reverse their mistakes, tried to restore balance, but by the time they acted, it was already too late. If they faced this kind of irreversible collapse, then their last messages to early humans would have come from a place of desperation, sorrow, and hope. Not hope for themselves, but for the species that would come after them, for us. Now imagine the Sumerians receiving these warnings second-hand, through stories from survivors or inherited memories. They may not have understood everything, but they understood enough that humanity's future depended on remembering the past. And so they encoded these messages into their origin stories, describing ages before humanity, beings of great power, cycles of destruction, and the importance of maintaining harmony with the natural order. These weren't just mythological embellishments, they were philosophical frameworks designed to shape humanity's values. But humanity eventually forgot. As civilizations rose across the centuries, each one believed it was the first. Each one believed its technologies were unprecedented. Each one believed it had transcended the fragility of nature. Yet every civilization also carried the same anxieties, fears of catastrophic floods, divine anger, cosmic upheaval, or sudden collapse. These fears appear universal because the memory behind them is universal. It's not cultural, it's inherited. And as humanity accelerates into an age of exponential growth, digital expansion, planetary manipulation, and cosmic exploration, the Sumerian warnings grow more relevant than ever. Because, for the first time since the forgotten species vanished, humanity is reaching the same threshold, the point where knowledge becomes powerful enough to transform the planet, but dangerous enough to destroy it. We may be walking the same razor's edge they once walked, unaware that the ground beneath us remembers how easily a world can fall. The Sumerians tried to tell us that nature has limits, that cycles have thresholds, that civilizations are not destroyed by the final event, but by the choices that lead to it. They tried to tell us that the forgotten species fell, not because they were weak, but because they believed they were invincible. And that belief, more than anything, sealed their fate. As we move deeper into this understanding, another question rises. What if the forgotten species left behind one final safeguard? Not a warning written in tablets, but something woven into the fabric of human development. An instinct, a feeling, a sense of déjà vu when humanity begins to repeat the same patterns. Could this instinct be what drives our fascination with apocalyptic stories, with ancient catastrophes, with myths of lost civilizations? Perhaps humans feel drawn to these themes because something in our subconscious already knows the truth. The cycle is real, and we are approaching its turning point. And this is why the Sumerian warnings matter more today than ever before. Not because they describe supernatural events, but because they describe natural consequences. They describe a species that pushed too far, too fast, without understanding the price. They describe a world that fought back. They describe a cycle that resets life when balance is lost. And as uncomfortable as this thought may be, it also carries hope, because awareness is the first step to breaking the cycle. If humanity can learn from the past, if we can recognize the patterns, if we can honor the knowledge preserved by the Sumerians, then perhaps we can navigate the turning point with wisdom rather than arrogance. Perhaps the forgotten species did not die in vain. Perhaps their final message didn't disappear. Perhaps it survived in the stories we dismiss as myth. And if you're still here with me, absorbing every detail, reflecting deeply on the implications of these ancient warnings, then I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, do you believe the cycle can be broken? If you do, type, "I choose awareness," so I know you're among the few who understand the importance of remembering what came before. And the deeper we go into the echoes of this forgotten cycle, the more we begin to grasp that the Sumerians weren't only preserving memory, they were preserving meaning. They weren't just recounting events from a past they barely understood. They were hinting at an underlying structure to reality, a pattern that governs the rise and fall of civilizations across unimaginable stretches of time. A pattern so old, so deeply rooted in the fabric of the earth, that even after the collapse of the forgotten species, fragments of it remained woven into the consciousness of the world itself. And as we trace those fragments through the Sumerian texts, we begin to see that they believed the collapse wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, metaphysical, existential, a rupture not only in the world, but in the identity of an entire species. To the Sumerians, the forgotten species represented more than a vanished civilization. They represented a warning about the nature of power. Power that disconnects a species from its origins. Power that blinds it to consequences. Power that reshapes the world until the world reshapes itself in response. They wrote of the pride that severs the sky, of the voice that commands the waters, of the hands that reshape the mountains, suggesting actions that bordered on the godlike. And yet their tone was never celebratory, it was mournful, as though they pitied the forgotten species for the very advancements that doomed them. Imagine a world where a species becomes so advanced that it forgets it is part of nature. It begins to treat the planet as something separate, something obedient, something malleable. The Sumerians may have inherited relics of this mindset, ruins built on a scale that dwarfed anything from their own time, structures aligned with stars in ways they could not replicate, evidence of engineering beyond their understanding. These could easily have been misinterpreted as works of gods. But beneath the reverence lies a subtle fear. If the forgotten species built wonders beyond comprehension, how powerful must their downfall have been to erase them almost completely? And that question leads us deeper into the Sumerian worldview. They believed the collapse wasn't merely the result of a single mistake, it was the culmination of a long sequence of imbalances. Imbalances in nature, in society, in energy, in the relationship between the species and the forces that sustain life. They described the collapse as the world turning against its makers, hinting that the forgotten species may have pushed the planet into a state where natural cycles rebelled. Perhaps they altered climates, manipulated resources, or triggered geological instability. Whatever they did, the Sumerians seemed convinced that their fate was earned, not accidental. But there's another layer to their warnings, a more psychological one. The Sumerians wrote of the emptiness that follows too much knowledge, a phrase that stands out because it suggests a cultural or existential collapse before the physical one. It implies that the forgotten species reached a point where their understanding of the universe outpaced their ability to give that understanding meaning. They may have become disconnected from purpose, identity, or unity, and this internal fragmentation may have weakened them long before the world delivered the final blow. This is where the Sumerian insights become eerily relevant to our own time. Humanity, too, is approaching a moment where our knowledge expands faster than our wisdom. We are unlocking forces we barely comprehend. We are altering the planet in ways invisible day to day, but undeniable across decades. And deep within our collective psyche, many people sense something ancient, a feeling that echoes from a forgotten age, a feeling that civilizations can crumble not from lack of intelligence, but from too much of it, wielded without balance. The Sumerians tried to remind us that no species, no matter how advanced, is immune to collapse if it forgets its connection to the natural order. They spoke of the boundaries the old ones crossed, as though pointing to a threshold between progress and hubris. A threshold that, once crossed, sets into motion forces no species can control. They believed the forgotten species crossed that threshold willingly, perhaps even proudly, never imagining that their world would retaliate. But the Sumerians also left clues, suggesting that the forgotten species did not vanish instantly. They described a period of chaos, confusion, and fragmentation, a time when the lights of the old world flickered, implying that remnants of their technologies persisted for a while before fading. This transitional period may have been the bridge between their age and ours, a shadow era where survivors attempted to preserve what they could, passing on knowledge to early humans before finally disappearing. These survivors may have been the ones later interpreted as the Anunnaki, not literal gods, but the last custodians of a dying civilization. Their instructions, warnings, and interventions may have shaped early humanity's development, giving rise to myths of divine teachers, celestial beings, and advanced creators. And the Sumerians, being the first to master writing, preserved these memories with a seriousness unmatched by other early cultures. Imagine how deeply their identity must have been shaped by this burden. The first civilization with writing, agriculture, astronomy, and law also believed they were living in the aftermath of a much greater world. They saw themselves as the inheritors of a broken legacy, responsible for carrying warnings across ages. And that belief infused everything they created, from temples to calendars to stories to rituals. But as centuries passed, the meaning faded. Humanity forgot. The cycle reasserted itself. And now, thousands of years later, we find ourselves at a point where the Sumerian warnings feel more like predictions than memories. We are altering the climate, exploring genetic engineering, manipulating energy on monumental scales, and venturing beyond our world, all actions that may mirror the final centuries of the forgotten species. The Sumerians wrote of the trembling of the world when balance is lost, a phrase that could be interpreted as geological upheaval, environmental collapse, or even cosmic consequences. And the question that grows louder with each step into the future is this: are we repeating the same pattern? The Sumerians seemed certain that every species eventually reaches a moment where it must choose between repeating the cycle and transcending it. This choice is not made through power, but through awareness, through remembering the past, even when that past has been buried or disguised. That's why their warnings matter so much. Not because they describe supernatural events, but because they describe universal principles. Civilizations fall when they lose balance. Species perish when they forget humility. Worlds collapse when inhabitants believe they are above the laws that govern existence. The forgotten species learned this lesson too late. The Sumerians hoped we would learn it in time, and if you're still here with me, absorbing these layers, connecting these fragments of forbidden history, then I want to hear your voice. Tell me in the comments, do you believe humanity can learn from a civilization that vanished before us? If you do, type, "I learn from the past," so I know you're one of the few who understand how essential these ancient warnings truly are. And as we move deeper into this labyrinth of ancient memory, something remarkable begins to happen. The Sumerian warnings stop feeling like myth and start feeling like pattern recognition, as though the scribes who carved those tablets understood that human civilization, in its ambition, curiosity, and hunger for progress, would eventually arrive at the same crossroads that the forgotten species once faced. They wrote not only for their time, but for ours. They preserved knowledge for a future humanity that would one day be powerful enough to need it and vulnerable enough to ignore it. The more we analyze the tone of their ancient texts, the more a subtle urgency emerges. Their words carry tension, a quiet desperation, as though they were trying to compress the final lessons of a dying world into symbols that could survive for thousands of years. The Sumerians weren't trying to glorify the forgotten species. They were trying to make sure we understood what destroyed them. They wrote of systems collapsing under the weight of their own shadows, of tools that surpassed the hands that forged them, of voices silenced by their own creation. These metaphors may be the closest they could come to describing technologies and societal breakdowns they themselves barely understood. Imagine early Sumerian scholars examining ruins left behind by the previous civilization. They would have found materials unyielding to their tools, remnants of structures misaligned with their architectural knowledge, stones cut with impossible precision, or chambers whose purposes were totally alien. They would have seen in these relics the unmistakable fingerprints of intelligence beyond anything in their world. And that realization may have frightened them as much as it fascinated them. Because if such a powerful species once existed, the question becomes, why did they fall? And what force was strong enough to erase them almost completely? As the Sumerians contemplated this, they seemed to sense that the forgotten species collapsed not from a single catastrophic event, but from a failure to respect the forces that sustain life. They hinted that the forgotten species reached beyond their limits, tampered with cosmic cycles, ignored environmental consequences, and perhaps even altered the planet in ways that destabilized its own balance. They wrote of the trembling of the world when its breath is taken, a chilling metaphor that feels like a warning about ecological collapse or planetary exhaustion. They described the sky crying out against its burdens, a phrase suggesting atmospheric anomalies, climate imbalance, or celestial disruption. And as we reflect on these phrases, we cannot ignore how closely they align with long-term patterns observable in every advanced civilization, including our own. Civilizations tend to expand until they strain their own foundations. Species tend to grow until they challenge the boundaries of the environment that sustains them. And when the pressure becomes too great, collapse follows, not as punishment but as consequence. To the Sumerians, this wasn't philosophy. It was memory. Memory they inherited from the final breaths of the forgotten species. They weren't imagining the cycle. They lived in the aftermath of it. They saw the traces of the old world scattered across their own. They felt the weight of a history far older than humanity. And they realized that if humans failed to learn from this hidden past, the cycle would inevitably repeat. Now consider this scenario. What if the forgotten species attempted to avert their collapse but acted too late? What if they had the technology, intelligence, and knowledge to foresee disaster, but lacked the unity, humility, or time to stop it? The Sumerians wrote about the Council of the Old Ones dividing, suggesting internal conflict among the forgotten species, disagreement about how to respond to the crisis, or whether intervention was possible. This division may have accelerated their downfall, leaving them vulnerable to the very forces they once commanded. Division, not ignorance, may have ended their world. This possibility adds a new layer of significance to the Sumerian warnings. It suggests that the forgotten species didn't fall because they lacked power, but because they misused it. They didn't collapse because they were weak, but because they were fractured. Their downfall came not from outside, but from within. And that message, preserved in the oldest writings on Earth, resonates with frightening clarity today. The Sumerians also described what they called the Age of Wandering Shadows, a transitional era after the collapse when survivors of the forgotten species roamed a ruined world. These beings may have been physically weakened, spiritually broken, or technologically crippled after the collapse of their systems. Yet they carried fragments of knowledge, enough to guide early humans, influence their development, and seed the beginnings of civilization. This period could explain why so many ancient cultures describe gods who taught them agriculture, astronomy, metallurgy, and architecture. These beings may not have been supernatural. They may have been the last remnants of a once great species, trying to pass on lessons that might save the next inhabitants of the earth. And as early humans absorbed these teachings, the stories transformed. The forgotten species became deities, celestial beings, or mythical ancestors. Their warnings became prophecies, their technologies became magic, their collapse became divine punishment. Yet at the core of those myths, something real endured, a message that outlived the species that created it. The Sumerians, being the first civilization to write, became the first to record it. And they did so with a seriousness that suggests they understood the magnitude of the task. They knew memory fades. They knew knowledge erodes. They knew that one day humanity might reach a level of advancement that mirrored the forgotten species. And when that day came, they hoped their words would still be here, urging caution, reminding us of what came before, anchoring us to a past we never lived but desperately need to understand. Because if we do not understand the forgotten species, we risk becoming them. Their ruins may be buried, but their pattern is alive. Their warnings may be ancient, but their relevance is modern. Their collapse may be distant, but the cycle is close. And once you begin to see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand the cycle, you cannot ignore it. Once you hear the Sumerian warnings, you cannot return to the comforting illusion that humanity is the first, the greatest, or the final species to rise upon this earth. We are not the first. We may not be the last, but we can be the first to break the cycle, if we choose to. And if you're still here, walking with me through these ancient shadows, absorbing this forgotten knowledge, then I want to hear your voice. Tell me in the comments, do you believe the forgotten species left their warnings specifically for us? If you do, type, "I hear their echoes," so I know you are among the few who truly understand the weight of these revelations. And as we stand here, in the middle of this unfolding revelation, something becomes undeniable. The deeper we descend into the Sumerian messages, the clearer it becomes that their warnings were not meant for casual readers, not meant for a single generation, and not meant to be dismissed as myth. They wrote with the awareness of a civilization that understood itself as a link in a much longer chain, a chain that stretched into an age before humanity, before history, before memory. And if their writings survived long enough to reach us, then perhaps they believed we would be the ones who needed them most. Because humanity is now walking into an age where our decisions echo across the world in ways no past culture could ever imagine. Our technologies have become extensions of our will. Our reach extends beyond our planet. Our influence reshapes the environment. And in this rapidly expanding horizon, the Sumerian warnings resonate like a distant alarm, faint, ancient, but unmistakably urgent. They speak to us from across millennia, whispering that we are not the first species to stand at this precipice. The forgotten species once stood here too, confident, ambitious, unstoppable, until the cycle pulled them back into the shadows of prehistory. As the Sumerians described the last days of the forgotten species, their tone shifts into something almost sorrowful, as if they felt a deep empathy for a civilization destroyed not by ignorance, but by its own brilliance. They wrote of the bright age that became too bright, suggesting a civilization that expanded its knowledge faster than it could expand its wisdom. They described the days when the world cracked beneath too many footsteps, an image that evokes overpopulation, resource exhaustion, or the strain of a species exceeding the carrying capacity of its environment. And in one symbolic line, they mention the song of the earth growing quiet, which may refer to ecological collapse, a loss of harmony so profound that even early humans inherited its consequences. These metaphors, though ancient, feel eerily modern. They mirror anxieties that humanity carries today, anxieties that rise in every major civilization at its peak. It is as if the forgotten species left behind emotional echoes, psychic fingerprints, resonances that replay through the collective mind of every culture that rises after them. We feel something is off, something is fragile, something is approaching, and we cannot fully explain why unless the memory is older than our species. The Sumerians also hinted that the forgotten species misinterpreted their own power. They believed themselves invincible, beyond correction, beyond consequence, and that blindness eventually became their downfall. This hubris, the belief that intelligence guarantees survival, is one of the most potent themes in Sumerian mythology. They believed the forgotten species had climbed too high and fallen too far, because they replaced reverence with dominance, curiosity with greed, and harmony with control. And if this pattern is universal, if it emerges naturally in any civilization approaching maximum complexity, then humanity is almost certainly walking the same path. But the Sumerians didn't only describe the collapse, they described the transition, the moment between worlds. They wrote of the long silence after the storm, a symbolic period where the last survivors wandered through the broken remnants of their world, isolated, burdened by the weight of knowledge no longer useful. These survivors, in their final hours, may have realized the full magnitude of their mistake, and perhaps that realization fueled their desire to warn the species that would come after them. They may not have been able to save themselves, but they could try to save us. And so their final messages, whatever form they took, were passed from species to species, diluted through oral tradition, distorted by myth, until the Sumerians finally captured them in writing. What the forgotten species intended as a last testament became the first chapter of human civilization. Their collapse became our origin story. Their warnings became our mythology. Their lessons became our rituals. And buried beneath all of this, like a heartbeat beneath the soil, lies the truth we were meant to remember. Every species that rises must face the consequences of its ascent. The Sumerians did not shy away from describing this cycle. They accepted it. They saw the earth as a living system, one that corrects itself when its inhabitants exceed their limits. They believed the forgotten species triggered a chain reaction, one that reshaped oceans, split continents, darkened skies, and forced the world into a state of renewal. To them, these were not supernatural punishments, but natural responses. The earth was not avenging itself, it was resetting. And if resets are part of the structure of existence, then perhaps the forgotten species did not disappear entirely. Perhaps they exist now only as dust in the ground, whispers in the wind, shadows in myth, but their warnings endure, and that endurance is what matters, because humanity now faces choices that mirror the decisions of the forgotten species. We must decide whether our power will be used responsibly, whether our curiosity will be tempered by humility, whether our ambition will be balanced by restraint, whether our advancements will align with the natural rhythms of the world or violate them. The Sumerians believed these choices determined the fate of every species that reaches a critical level of development, and they believed humanity's moment of choice would eventually come. That moment is now. We stand at the edge of the same cycle the forgotten species once walked. And as the Sumerian warnings resurface, woven across time and memory, they ask us a single question. Will humanity repeat the forgotten pattern, or will we become the first species to break the cycle? As we reflect on these ancient messages, the weight of the past settles upon us like dust from a forgotten world. The Sumerians hoped that when we finally reached this moment, we would listen, truly listen. to the echoes of the species that came before us. Because if we can understand why they fell, we can understand how to rise differently. And if você está aqui ainda comigo, absorvendo cada detalhe, então eu quero ouvir você. Diga nos comentários. Você acredita que a humanidade está pronta para mudar o ciclo? Se acreditar, escreva I choose a new path para mostrar que você faz parte dos poucos que realmente entendem a importância dessa mensagem ancestral. If you made it all the way to the end of this journey, that already tells me something about you. It tells me you're not just curious, you're awake. You're one of the few who listens to the echoes of the ancient world, who sees the patterns most people ignore, who understands that these warnings were never meant to be forgotten. So before you go, do one thing to prove you're part of this circle of seekers. Write in the comments, I will remember the ones before us. This simple phrase helps this message travel further, and it shows me you're someone who truly understands the importance of what we uncovered here today. And if this video opened your mind, if it made you question our history or rethink the cycle we're living in, then hit the like button. It tells YouTube that this story matters, and it helps more people who are searching for hidden truth find their way here. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because this journey doesn't end here. There are more tablets to decipher, more forgotten stories to uncover, more warnings to decode, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Now, the next video is already waiting for you. Go ahead, click it, continue the investigation, follow the trail the Sumerians left behind. Your path doesn't end, it evolves.